Welcome to this video. We should now go ahead and create a new controller for our passengers. So if a passenger registers, well, sort of registers for booking a flight, we should track that information about which passengers exist in our application right now. So in this 21-day challenge, we will for sure not use a real database. Instead, we will use only in-memory saving. However, if you are interested in authorization and authentication and in using a real SQL database, you should follow up with one of the additional challenges to extend this application even further. So in your project, right-click on your controllers folder, create or add a new controller, and on the left side select API and then take the API controller empty. Let's click add. As name we pass in Passenger Controller and then we hit enter. Now, one thing to mention here directly, you can see the route is by default set to API/controller. But if we take a look at our flight controller, you can see that our route here is just starting with controller. So it would be flight. Now, inside of the passenger controller that we have just created, remove the API/. We don't want our API endpoints starting at API/, right? We want to start it directly at /passenger, for example, not /API/passenger. Okay, so route and then controller, and for sure we used it API controller, and as you can see, also this controller here is inherited by the controller base. Now we need to create an endpoint for registration. Right now we don't really have to write the logical code. We only want to have that endpoint to really try to connect the Angular form to that endpoint so that everything is working fine, and afterwards we can track the registered users inside of a static list, for example. So create a public iAction result, right? Remember, iAction results are capable of returning status codes. Then we have a name, we call it register. And we simply, since we are not writing any code right now, which handles the registration, we go ahead and throw a new not implemented exception, right? We are professional programmers, so that's what we're doing. Now, think about the last day. What have you learned? First of all, this is an HTTP post endpoint. Why? Pretty simple. This is registration, and registration creates something new, okay? If you create an account, you use HTTP post because you create something new on the server. So instead of HTTP GET, you now use that HTTP post attribute right here. And as I said, just remember a day back, we should now attach some attributes for produce response type. So let's think about what responses we should return from here. So what response types are getting produced? We got that 201. Just remember to the presentation earlier, 201 stands for created new or new created, right? So if we register, we don't return 200 because a successful HTTP post should return a 201 for new create. So this is best practice, keep that in mind. Produces response type, for sure, we have any sort of 400 from client side, right? Anything here gone wrong from the client side, and for sure 500 when it comes to failure of database connection or whatever, something that fails on server side. Now, this is all we have to do. We should now be able to take a look at that register endpoint. Let's save it here. Now think about when we register a new passenger, we will need to have some information here, right? So what's the email address or what's the name, for example. So every time when you create something new, you most likely want to receive some information, right? So if you want to create a blog post, for example, you want to have a title and a description. If you want to register a user, you want to have a name and an email address, maybe birth date and all of that. If you want to create a hotel booking, you want to have a room number and a guest name and maybe arrival and departure time, for example. If you want to create something, you mostly want to have specific information. I don't want to go ahead here and say, okay, we have string username, we have string email address, we have a string pre-name and string last name. Right? So instead of that, we will now create a so-called data transfer object, or in short, DTO. Actually, it's just a simple C# class, or we use a record right here, but it could also be a simple class. Once we have that created, we can use that class or record here as a parameter, and then we can go ahead and take the information from one object instead of from multiple parameters, right? So in your project, create a new folder. So click on flights here or whatever you have named your project, click on add and add a new folder. and let's call it DTOs. So data transfer objects. That's what it means. Right click on it and let's add a new C# class, and we call that new passenger DTO. There we go. Now for sure this will be a class by default. When we make this a record, we already did that before, so we can remove the braces here, the curly braces, and instead add some parameter brackets. And then inside here we say string email, for example, string first name, string last name, there you go, last name, and bool for gender. As you can imagine, if you have any other type of application, you can for sure create a DTO which contains your specific information, right? So for now, this is how a passenger in our case looks like. Great. Now switch back to the flight controller. Now switch back to our passenger controller. And here say using flights.dtos. Now we can scroll down, and inside of the register action, we can go ahead and use our new passenger DTO. Let's call it DTO, for example, right? So this is also just preparation. We don't have to do anything with it right now, but that's the structure of what information we want to have. So if you call the register endpoint here, you want to provide the information about the new passenger. So email, first name, last name, and gender. And we can provide that information as JSON, and then C# here or ASP.NET Core will automatically map it to that new passenger data transfer object. Now let's save it here and then take a look at our Swagger UI. So here we are now at that Swagger UI again. And if you cannot see passenger here, you need to go ahead and start your application again so that it really compiles from scratch. Now let's take a look. We open that up, and you can see an example value would look like email, first name, last name, and gender, right? So this is exactly the type of our DTO or the fields. Now you can also see the documentation. Responses could be 201 created, 400 bad request, and 500 server error. Now let's try that. Try it out, and let's hit execute. I mean, we can enter here some real values, but that's fine. Let's simply press execute. And you can see the response status code here is 500, which is fine, which is a server error. Take a look here. The method or operation is not implemented, right? System not implemented exception. And that totally makes sense because here in our code, we have the throw new not implemented exception. So this here is coming from the server, right? Because ASP is running on the server, and you can guess that it then for sure returns the 500, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing a 500 error response, which is saying not implemented because it's a server-side, well, problem. Now we don't have that implemented yet, so it's not a real problem because we haven't even written the logical code behind it. Great, now it's time to switch back to Angular again and make sure to update the client-side code.